What's an NSFW fact about history that we don't get to hear too often? During wartime some armies would wipe it on their spears so that when they stabbed/slashed enemies they'd get that extra poison damage. The deadliest female serial killer in US history had murdered 35 people with an axe by the time she was 18 years old. The author of Frankenstein lost her virginity on top of her mum's grave. From the 13th to the 15th of February the Romans celebrated Lupercalia, Roman precursor of Valentine's Day, which was a festival of love and fertility. Priests would sacrifice a goat and then cut the goat skin into pieces. Part of this they would wear on their heads, and other parts were cut into thongs. The men would then run around the city of Rome naked, hitting as many women with these thongs as they possibly could. Being hit would help with pregnancy or becoming pregnant, so depending on what they wanted, the women would either deliberately stand in the way of the men, or try to run away while pretty much everyone was naked. In another part of the festivities men would draw names of women from a jar and the goal was that they'd stay together for the duration of the festival. This would often result in a lot of, intercourse, and sometimes people actually fell in love and got married after they met during Lupercalia. When Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was taken from Zion Abbey to the Tower of London to prepare for her execution, she sailed in a barge down the River Thames. She passed under London Bridge, where the severed heads of her alleged lovers Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were waiting for her, displayed on spikes, rotting and picked at by birds. Witches were more often mutilated than actually burned. Victor Hugo, the guy who wrote, among other things, Les Misregistered Sign Rables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was a sex addict. He claimed he and his wife had sex 9 times on their wedding night. When she got bored with this, and I don't blame her for that, it just all sounds way too much, he proceeded to go and bang everyone and everything that caught his eye. When he died the brothels in Paris were closed down for the day so all the prostitutes could go and pay their respects to him. Fittingly, Paris apparently experienced a mini baby boom 9 months after his funeral, which 2 million people attended. Benjamin Franklin had a fart fetish. There are letters that prove this where he writes to a woman about her flatulence. Pope Alexander VI might have held orgies where he kept track of men's orgasms while he held the position of Pope and also definitely had an infidelity fetish, especially with women whose wedding he'd officiated. He had 4 kids with 1 married noblewoman, and at least another 3-5 outside of that. Anne Frank's diary was censored for her privacy. She wrote many entries about masturbation and her bisexuality. Her father cut those out. 1984. During the Iraq-Iran War, Iraqi forces had laid hundreds of exposed electrical wires in the Maynoon marshes which they knew the Iranians had to cross. Those wires were all snaked together and connected to large electrical generators. When Iran attempted to cross the marsh with boats, Iraq used just enough concentrated artillery to force the Iran soldiers out of the boats and walk through the marshland. As soon as that happened, the Iraqis fired up their generators and electrocuted thousands of Iranian soldiers in an instant. That's not the worst part. The Iraqis then sent in a road building detail and collected all of the Iranian dead and stacked the bodies like cordwood, 5 corpses high and 5 across, covering them with lime and then a bunch of sand. They used the Iranian dead to build a road for their trucks to cross the marshlands. The sheer hatred, madness and precision needed to pull this operation off, as well as carry it through, is just horrific to think about. Lot of people banged in the White House on the day of Andrew Jackson's inauguration. How about the time that NASA funded a study about dolphin communication that ended with one researcher giving a dolphin that was high on LSD a hand job? King Tut's first wife was his half-sister, but she also may have been his full sister and even at one point may have been his stepmother. During the abuse of Nanking there were accounts of Japanese troops forcing families to commit incestuous acts. Sons were forced to abuse their mothers, and fathers were forced to abuse their daughters. Mozart was into scat humor, like, a lot. Romans loved depicting sexual acts on many everyday items, like oil lamps, combs, bowls, etc. You often see images of people ducking, like porn but in daily life. Read about Capt Cook. He discovered Hawaii, They docked offshore right at harvest time. The natives thought they were fertility gods and sent their women in canoes to the ship. The crew had a blast year after year. Until the natives figured out what was happening. Edgar Allan Poe married his 13-year-old cousin when he was 27. Genghis Khan's generals, Jebe and Sabute, after defeating the Russians, laid thousands of them bound and stacked like cordwood, and built a platform above where he and his generals feasted. All the while the men below suffocated and were crushed to death. Source: Dan Carlin's excellent The Wrath of the Khans series. Edit: it was the generals. Always blame the generals. You know that one psychologist guy, Freud? Well, one time he was tasked with finding the testicles of an eel. So he got literally hundreds of eels so he could find their balls. Nowadays we know eels have retractable testicles. But Freud didn't know that. So he cut up hundreds of eels looking for their testicles. This thread is half fun silly things, and half horrible atrocities. What a freaking rollercoaster, man. Ways popes have died. Pope John VI was bludgeoned to death by the husband of his mistress when he caught them in flagrante delicto. John VI met his end, so to speak, when a cuckolded husband rammed a poker up his bottom. Pope Leo VI suffered a fatal heart attack during sex with a page boy. I've read so much about Lyndon B. Johnson's cock on Reddit, it's unreal. In the 1880s, James Jameson, heir to the vast Jameson Irish whiskey fortune, purchased a 10-year-old African girl just so he could draw her being eaten by cannibals. The CIA once considered sending the Soviets condoms that were large labeled small to convince them that the US was well endowed. Source: edit: typo. May have already been said. There are thousands of comments, but Pope Alexander VI threw a party that is referred to today as the Joust of Whores. He had a large number of women attend a banquet he was throwing, get naked, and would scramble to pick up chestnuts that the Pope and other people at the party threw at them. This party was followed by Alexander holding a contest to see who could sleep with the most women by the end of the night. During the whole thing his kids were also present. Alexander also liked watching his horses breed and would arrange for upwards of 100 horses put outside his palace so he could watch them for hours. Edit: I'm aware that Salmonella made a video with this guy in it. He did not invent Alexander VI. I knew about him from AC2 and investigated further. In 1488 an Italian noblewoman, Katarina Schwarzeriou, locked herself in a castle to save herself from her enemies. Her enemies managed to capture her children and threatened to kill Gem if she wouldn't surrender. She climbed on ramparts, lifted her skirt to expose her female parts and shouted, "Fools! Don't you see that I can make myself more children?" The Romans would often include bestiality as halftime shows for their gladiator matches with strange animals up to and including swans. The dildo was created almost 1,500 years before the wheel. French modern philosopher Michel Foucault, in addition to studying crime and deviance in a criminology sense, also applied his theories on punishments to his fascination with BDSM, having also written a number of kink-based works. He eventually moved to San Francisco and partook in gay bathhouses, notorious for casual sex. He eventually caught HIV, and some have speculated, it may be written somewhere, that he purposely contracted it as some sort of poetic social commentary. Oddly, I learned this stuff while getting my administration of justice major and studying corrections. Lol. At the Temple of Aphrodite in Cyprus, overlooking the legendary birthplace of Aphrodite, young virgin girls would tie a bowstring around their head and await a man to come along and throw a silver coin of any value into their lap. The man would say, "I demand thee in the name of the goddess." The girl then had to have sex with the man. In this way the girl would make her first fruit offering to Aphrodite. It is said that some girls had to come back for many days before they were chosen. There are disputed claims that both Napoleon's and Rasputin's members were, well, dismembered during their respective autopsies and have traveled the world extensively, possibly farther than either men ever did, as well as being shown in multiple occasions to the public. On a similar note, it is well known LBJ had a massive Johnson, and Rasputin's girthy sklong was venerated amongst high-class women of his time. No wonder he's indeed Russia's greatest love machine. It is speculated that the crotch is part of the armor, codpiece, was enlarged, not to make the knights and kings' junk look bigger, but to alleviate the pain caused by syphilis when their genitals made contact with the metal pieces. Astronomer here. In 1992, two astronauts did not disclose they were married to NASA until it was too late to replace one of them and thus became the first married couple in space, while the two astronauts in question are not the kiss and tell types. Most people assume this means SpaceX has happened. Obviously you don't have to be married to try it, but it does make it harder to figure out the couples. NASA's official stance is that it hasn't, but I'm not sure people really believe them. Pope John XI was interesting. He became Pope in 955. His high points are: turned the sacred palace into a whorehouse, fornicated with, among others, his father's concubine, various widows and even his own niece, castrated and then murdered a cardinal, blinded and then murdered his confessor, took payment for ordaining bishops and even ordained a 10-year-old boy as a bishop, ordained a deacon in a stable, refused to make the sign of the cross, toasted the devil, invoked the names of pagan gods while playing dice, and when he lost, used money from the papal treasury to pay off his debts. Granted, he was a teenager when he became pope, thanks to his dad buying the office, but still. Not NSFW but James Buchanan, US president, never cohabitated with his wife, and after his death several love letters were found that he had written to his assumed lifelong male partner. Sparta is a treasure trove for this kind of thing. Sparta's marriage rituals involved the kidnapping of a girl, then dressing them in men's clothing and shaving their heads so they looked like a man before having sex with them. James Joyce wrote the dirtiest letters ever written. I did as you told me, you dirty little girl, and pulled myself off twice when I read your letter. I am delighted to see that you do like being ducked arseways. Yes, now I can remember that night when I ducked you for so long backwards. It was the dirtiest ducking I ever gave you. Darling, my prick was stuck up in you for hours, ducking in and out under your upturned rump. I felt your fat sweaty buttocks under my belly and saw your flushed face and mad eyes. At every duck I gave you, your shameless tongue come bursting out through your lips, and if I gave you a bigger stronger duck than usual, fat dirty farts came spluttering out of your backside. You had an ass full of farts that night, darling, and I ducked them out of you. Big fat fellows, long windy ones, quick little merry cracks, and a lot of tiny little naughty farters ending in a long gush from your hole. It is wonderful to duck a farting woman when every duck drives one out of her. I think I would know Nora's fart anywhere. I think I could pick hers out in a room full of farting women. It is a rather girlish noise, not like the wet windy fart which I imagine fat wives have. It is sudden and dry and dirty, like what a bold girl would let off in fun in a school dormitory at night. I hope Nora will let off no end of her farts in my face so that I may know their smell also. A Nazi doctor injected blue dye into the eyes of hundreds of Jewish people in an effort to make them Aryan. He blinded many people. Back during the age of sail, sailors would go months and months without any women or any privacy. When they'd get to port, hundreds of prostitutes would take boats out to the ships to greet the sailors, who would almost all have a sex with at least one. This included the ship's boys. Like I said, there was no privacy at all. The crew would share one huge room, dozens or hundreds of men sleeping in hammocks slung 28 inches apart. So the ensuing copulation took place in the wide open. Hundreds of people having sex all over the ship in plain sight. This wasn't a rare thing. It was almost universal, though some more religious captains wouldn't let the prostitutes on board. STDs were therefore incredibly common. Side point, British sailors got a full ration of rum equal to 8 shots every day. If they were not long out of port, they got a full gallon of beer daily. When people complain about moral decay of society, it really just means to me that they don't know about history. Society is quite chaste today compared to much of the past. History would be everyone's favorite subject in school if the books focused on the things mentioned in this thread. Ciabatta was invented in 1982. Columbus sold kids as hoes. Zhang Zongchang, a Chinese warlord dubbed by Time as China's basest warlord, was nicknamed Old 86, which referred to either his height or the length of his D, which was rumored to be as long as 86 Mexican silver dollars stacked together. He was also a poet. Case in point, You Tell Me to Do This He tells me to do that. You're all bastards. Go duck your mother. Poem about bastards by Zhang Zongchang. There was also this one time during a famine where he visited a temple and, instead of praying and offering gifts, slapped the temple's statue and said, "Duck your sister. How dare you make Shandong's people suffer by not giving us rain." Then proceeded to order his artillery to shoot into the sky until it rained. It rained the next day. Edit. Minor grammatical corrections. Lyndon B. Johnson was quite a vulgar president. He has been reported to have carried meetings into the restroom if he had to use the restroom during the meeting. He also referred to his Johnson as Jumbo, and you can easily find recordings of him making a phone call to a tailor requesting his pants be made with extra room in the area. Edit. Change the wording. People have been having sex all throughout history. More than I'll be arriving in Paris tomorrow evening. Don't wash. Apparently Napoleon loved smelly pussies. Like love them. Machiavelli wrote a letter to his friend about how he ducked a prostitute, then threw up all over her when the lights came on, because she was so ugly. More than I was now completely terrified. However, since I was alone with her in the dark, I gave her a good hump, even though I found her thighs flabby, her genitals greasy and her breath stinking a bit. My lust was so desperate that I went ahead and gave it to her anyway. When their liaison was over, Machiavelli managed to find a lamp and was able to shine a light on the woman. More than my god. She was so ugly that I almost dropped dead as a tuft of hair, half white and half black. The top of her head was bald, which allowed you to see several lice taking a stroll as her eyebrows were full of nits, one eye looked down and the other up. Her tear ducts were full of mucus, her nose was twisted into a peculiar shape. The nostrils were full of snot and one of them was half missing. Her mouth looked like Lorenzo de Medici's, twisted on one side and drooling since she had no teeth to keep the saliva in her mouth. Her lip was covered with a thin but rather long moustachius. When the woman spoke to him, Machiavelli was struck by her stinking breath and, more than I have so much that I vomited all over her. Edit. Link. The can-can dance was considered very scandalous and obscene because it required high kicks, and women of that time wore pantalettes which had an open crotch. Mary Toft put baby rabbits in her V and then pretended to give birth to them to confuse doctors. In colonial America, a guy was arrested and charged because he drew a lewd image of his wife in the snow. Puritans didn't appreciate the art. Georgios Karaskakis, Greek general during the Greek War of Independence, was at one point arrested by the Ottomans and asked to surrender. Karaskakis was known for swearing a lot. His response was, "I asked my DK and it told me no, not to surrender." There is a legal D size in Iceland. It's an old law from the Middle Ages after a woman was married off to a man and on her wedding night was so disappointed with how small his D was that she took him back to the church to have an annulment. Because of her, a law was made that a man must be at least 3 inches while hard to marry. There is a wonderful documentary called The Final Member in which this is an actual problem. There is a carving on the side of the belfry in Ghent that depicts a man suckling the breast of a woman. The story is that the man was condemned to die unless he could prove his innocence by surviving imprisonment without food for 40 days. He could have visitors during his imprisonment, but they of course were checked for food. His daughter visited him every day. She was a wet nurse. He was let go after 40 days having survived. It was believed Edward II of England was murdered by a red hot poker up his ass. The actual death of Ratcliffe, you know, the oddly proportioned villain from Pocahontas? From the Encyclopedia Virginia, Morthand colonists, led by Captain John Ratcliffe, walked into an ambush. About 33 men, or 2/3 of their number, were killed. The Indians captured Ratcliffe, and their women skinned him alive using mussel shells. Slave owners in the US had a health official who would lick slaves to see if their health was of good standing. Roman troops were provided cow intestines condoms, as STD epidemics could decide the fate of entire wars. In Pisa on St. Catherine's Day, students would search for and capture the fattest Jew they could find and demand a ransom of his weight in sweets. Source: The Great Mortality, John Kelly. There was a guy that tried to prove that yellow fever wasn't contagious, and so he would pour the infected vomit into his freshly cut opened wood, pouring it into his eyes, and drinking it, and soaking into a bath of it. and smearing his body with blood, piss, and spit. He was fine because yellow fever isn't spread through direct contact. It's spread through mosquitoes. So he did all that for nothing. His name was Stubbians Firth, look it up. In line with some of the other horrible stories here, when the Roman statesman Sejanus, the Emperor Tiberius' right-hand man, fell from grace and was executed, the Roman people were eager to take their revenge on his family as well for all the tyranny he had put them through. So they decided to kill his young son and daughter as well. There was no real issue about killing the boy, but when it came to the young girl there was a sudden outcry. It was against all precedent to execute an innocent young girl, and above that, deeply impious to put to death a virgin maid, so they had the executioner abuse her first. The Assyrians decapitated their enemies and had their heads watch them abuse their wives. Edit. Vocab. Oh man. Do I have a book suggestion for you? All the best NSFW facts from arts and business topics and medicine. One of my favorite pieces is on Mark Twain's defense of small D's when invited to a big D boat cruise. There are pieces on erotic church art used to increase attendance. There is the history of women's underwear. It has it all and it is great for dinner parties. But some of the facts are so out there people will doubt what you are saying. Personally, this book has led to several expeditions to the Library of Congress. I can't suggest the book enough. Edit. Added more context and stories. Registered sign Lix Faure. The French president in 1899 died in LLS registered signee while being with a prostitute. Not too NSFW, but a fun story regardless. In ancient Egypt around 570 BC the situation for the Egyptian empire is growing more and more grim. The current pharaoh Apries kept on losing important battles to the other expanding kingdoms and empires around Egypt. The population thus grew more and more discontent with his god status and started to lose faith in his ability to reign the country. Slowly but surely a group of usurpers started gathering numbers to eventually overthrow Apries. As an answer to this he sent one of his best generals, Amasis, to beat down the potential rebellion before it would even break out. However, upon arrival Amasis was convinced to join the cause of the rebellion. After not having heard back from his general in a while, Apries decided to inquire a bit further and eventually found out that Amasis had crossed him. Furious he sent out a messenger to retrieve Amasis, who, in the meantime, had been elected the rebellion's leader. When the messenger, Ptolemy, arrived this scenario played out, when Ptolemy came and summoned Amasis. Amasis, sitting on horseback, raised his leg and farted, telling the messenger to take that back to Apries. He went on to successfully dethrone Apries and became known as the last of the great kings of the late dynasty.